Welcome to this afternoon's hearing on the Internal Revenue Service's Exempt Organization Division. In May, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration released an audit exposing the Internal Revenue Service's practice of targeting applicants for tax-exempt status based on name and policy position. The audit confirmed what many feared, that the IRS was treating applicants differently based on their beliefs by subjecting them to endless delays and intrusive information requests. Today, we want to bring that disinfecting sunshine to the audit branch of the IRS as well. Since the release of the Inspector General's report, the Ways and Means Committee has sought to determine the extent of the targeting and who was responsible. Additionally, we are working to ensure that the IRS is addressing the failures or wrongdoing that led to the targeting and making progress to restore the public trust in the agency. To date, committee staff have reviewed a total of 25 IRS officials and interviewed a total of 25 IRS officials and is reviewing roughly 300,000 internal IRS documents that have been provided. And while the investigation is far from over, it's now possible to make some provisional findings. We now know that in May of 2010, Lois Lerner, the former head of Exempt Organizations Division, currently on paid administrative leave, was told that Tea Party cases were being held pending guidance from Washington, D.C. We now know that Lois Lerner took a special interest in the Tea Party based on an email sent to colleagues in February of 2011 saying that, quote, the Tea Party matter was very dangerous, and in follow-up email suggesting how to deny the applications. We now know more than 298 applications were put on hold, and from committee review of each individual case, investigators discovered that 248, or 83%, were right-leaning, and 29, or 10%, were left-leaning. Of the right-leaning groups, only 45% have been approved, while 70% of the left-leaning groups have been approved. 100% of the groups with progressive in their name were approved. We now know that of all the groups that were inappropriately subject to demands to divulge their donors, 89% were right-leaning. And we now know 4 months after the audit's release, there continues to be some confusion in Cincinnati about how to handle so-called advocacy cases. Investigations often take unexpected turns, and this one's no exception. In the fall of 2010, Lois Lerner explained to a group of Duke University students that following the Citizens United decision, 501c4 organizations were getting involved in political activity. She said, and I quote, "Everybody is screaming at us, fix it now before the election," end quote. But Lerner explained, quote, "I won't know until I look at their 990s next year whether they have done more than their primary activity is political or not. So I can't do anything right now," end quote. To date, the investigation's focus has been on the IRS's handling of applications for organizations seeking exemption. But Lerner's remarks when she said, and I quote again, "I can't do anything right now," end quote, raises questions over the role of the examinations unit, which handle Form 990s, the annual form that's filled by exempt organizations. Since spotting the issue, the committee has begun to pursue a new branch of the investigation, that is, whether Lerner used the exempt organization's examinations unit to target right-leaning groups. Keep in mind, this is different from the determinations unit where the investigation is focused so far. The committee has discovered that among the hastily approved applications for exempt status in the early summer of 2012, a large number were flagged for IRS surveillance by Washington, D.C. Of those flagged, more than 80% of the groups were right-leaning. The IRS surveillance program, called a Review of Operations, is conducted by the EO Examinations Unit in Dallas and involves the monitoring of a group's activity. The consequences of being in the program is that surveillance can lead to an audit. Additionally, we discovered that through a process approved by Lerner, EO Examinations itself flags groups for surveillance based on complaints received from inside and outside the agency. 94% of all organizations flagged for surveillance by the examinations unit were right-leaning. But most startling in all of this, of the organizations referred for audit from this process, 100% were right-leaning. To highlight the question of whether the examinations process is unbiased, the IRS informed the committee 2 weeks ago that it had suspended both the surveillance orders from D.C. and the audits pending further review. 4 months after Lois Lerner's apology for targeting, there are many questions that are still outstanding, and frankly, we still don't have all the answers that we need. What is clear is that the IRS faces a long road to recover its reputation, and the only way to get there is through transparency and accountability. And with that, I would be happy to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Lewis from Georgia, for an opening statement.
But thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding today's hearing on Internal Revenue Service. I'm pleased to have Acting Commissioner Warford before us today. I look forward to discussing the positive changes Mr. Warford has made as a result of the recommendation from his 30-day report. From the outset, the Democrats have been crystal clear on this issue. The IRS was very wrong to use inappropriate criteria to single out organization by name, rather than by actual activity, when processing tax-exempt applications. Mr. Warford, we appreciate the swift action you are taking to restore the public trust and to enhance the integrity of the IRS. We believe you're on the right path, and we value your effort as we move forward. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle continue to frame this issue as a partisan one, as only affecting conservative groups. Time and time again, the facts have shown that both Republican-leaning and Democratic-leaning groups were singled out during the application process. In fact, the IRS Inspector General, appointed by former President Bush, testified many times under oath that he found no evidence of political motivation in the selection of tax-exempt application. His office also found no evidence of political motivation after reviewing over 5,500 emails from IRS employees. We know why we are here today: for Republicans to distract us from their lack of a positive legislative agenda to improve the economy, create jobs, and fund the government. In fact, a report released by the IRS Inspector General on yesterday stated the enforcement collection was down by $5 billion. That's 9% in fiscal year 2012 because of budget cuts. The sequester is harming government operation. We need to be focused on ending sequestering and creating livable jobs. I urge each and every member of this committee to come together and join a bipartisan effort. We must help the IRS improve its service to the American people rather than continue wrongly to cast partisan blame. Mr. Commissioner, I look forward to hearing from your testimony. And thank you very much. And that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our witness today, Mr. Daniel Werfel, Acting Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Acting Commissioner Werfel, thank you for joining us today. I know you've been very busy, and we appreciate you being here with us today to provide testimony. The subcommittee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. As is customary, you'll have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks, and you may begin, sir.
Chairman Boustany, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss current practices and procedures of the IRS Exempt Organizations Division. The IRS has been moving aggressively to implement the robust action plan outlined in my 30-day report to correct the problems with 501c4 application process described in the TIGTA report released in May. Through this action plan, we are making improvements throughout the exempt organizations area and are undertaking a major effort to examine other aspects of IRS operations to reduce future risks to the tax system. The progress we are making is fostered by the new leadership team installed within EO and also in the top echelons of the agency. The leadership team blends management experts from outside the agency with longtime IRS leaders from other divisions who have proven track records in their areas of expertise. Our progress is also a testament to the dedication and commitment of the employees within our determinations unit and throughout exempt organizations. The last few months have been extraordinarily active ones. We are carrying out a robust project management plan coordinated by the Commissioner's Office to implement more than 60 action items. These 60-plus items encompass the 9 recommendations included in the TIGTA report, as well as other actions we are taking. Highlights of what we have accomplished to date include the following. First, we have improved the screening criteria for applications for tax-exempt status. Since the BOLO lists were suspended in June, we have issued guidelines and instructions to EO personnel requiring screening assessments to be based on activity, not names or labels. Second, we have strengthened checks and balances in cases where additional detailed information is needed to process an application for tax-exempt status. Managers are now reviewing these requests before they are sent out, and we are working to standardize their language. Third, we have enhanced training for the exempt organization's personnel and the proper ways to review applications to determine the extent of political campaign activities. Verbal and written instructions have been issued to managers and screeners, and we are working to incorporate this information into our formalized instruction, particularly the Internal Revenue Manual. Fourth, we have reduced the inventory of 501c4 applications, including the group of 132 cases pending for 120 days or more as of late May. As of last week, 91 of those 132 cases, or 69%, have been closed, of which 70 applications were approved. This includes 36 organizations that took advantage of a self-certification option we recently offered. Fifth, we have broadened our scope beyond 501c4 case inventory to also investigate ways to reduce the inventory of applications for 501c3 status. Sixth, we have launched the Enterprise Risk Management Program, which will enhance our ability to identify and manage future risks wherever they may exist within the IRS. Seventh, we are using a Lean Six Sigma management methodology within exempt organizations to further improve the determinations process and more efficiently process applications. Eighth, we are implementing a comprehensive plan for reviewing audit selection criteria throughout the IRS to ensure fairness and impartiality. And ninth, we are working with the National Taxpayer Advocate to increase taxpayers' awareness of mechanisms at their disposal for resolving issues within the IRS. Amid all the efforts the IRS is making to improve operations, we are still mindful of the responsibility we have to ensure tax compliance. While we work to ensure fairness and efficiency in making determinations about tax exemption, we will continue to uphold the law as it relates to exempt organizations, and we will continue to meet our obligation to grant tax-exempt status only to those organizations that are fully eligible. We are also mindful of the need to be transparent and to work closely with Congress. We seek to be as responsive as possible to requests for information from congressional committees in order to help them carry out their responsibility to oversee our agency and its operations. For example, we have reviewed and produced roughly 390,000 pages of documents in response to requests from this committee. We still have a great work to do in setting a course for the IRS, and many challenges remain, but I believe that we are moving in the right direction and will continue to make progress in the weeks and months ahead. This concludes my statement, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Werfel. And let me start by saying we received a number of documents toward the end of August, and we appreciate that. And we still have outstanding requests in place, and we expect that you'll continue on the same path to get these documents to us as quickly as possible.
We will.
One of the alarming findings so far in our investigation is the effect or a seeming effect of this IRS surveillance program, and we're trying to get a better handle on it. The IRS gives it the name Review of Operations as part of the examinations program, but under the program, the IRS may lack a compelling reason to deny an organization tax-exempt status, so the organization is approved, but then the IRS then, I guess, secretly decides to keep tabs on it, monitoring the group's website and public documents and activities. Sometimes this can turn into a full-blown audit. And worst of all, just based on some of the statistics we've seen in this, it appears that right-leaning groups were targeted almost exclusively. And, you know, the statistics don't lie. I mean, we have statistics. So just to review that again, of all the groups, EO determinations referred to the surveillance program, 83% were right-leaning. Of all groups selected for surveillance, 94% were right-leaning. And finally, all groups that were subjected to surveillance were selected for a full-blown audit, 100% of them being right-leaning. I want to give you an opportunity to explain that because we saw those numbers and it certainly raised flags.
I can explain, or I can offer some additional information and context. First of all, I think we need to pause on the numbers that you are reporting because I think there may be some discrepancies between the information that I have.
Well, this is the information we have in documents. You may have, you know.
Part of the challenge here in a limited time is to explain the process for the review of operations. So there's some background and context. You referred to it earlier as secretive, and I intend to not be secretive at all and answer any questions that you have about that process. But the way the process works, in essence, is we get referrals for exam. We get referrals from exam from other parts of the IRS. We get referrals from exam from other agencies in government, from members of Congress, from members of the public. And the question is, how do we deal with all those referrals, and how do we decide what to do with them in terms of whether an entity an exam is warranted or not? And we have set up a process called the review of operations, where if the referral is about the question of whether an entity is engaged in political activity such that it would potentially call into a question their tax-exempt status, we've set up a process to deal with that type of referral. And we have someone in our examinations process who looks at that referral, and if it is political and they determine that it's political, we'll send it to a reviewer in the RU, or the review of operations, and they will take a look and they will assess it and research it and determine, is this a case that's potentially worthy of exam, and what priority should it be placed? So they'll take that case and they'll make a decision. They might decide no exam is necessary. They might decide an exam is appropriate and they might decide it's high priority, or they might decide an exam is appropriate and they might decide it's medium priority. If they decide that that an exam should happen, they will forward that to a committee. We call it the Committee of Three, and these are made up of there's 3 people, experienced civil servant, frontline management officials, and they decide by majority of vote whether, yes, indeed, this referral does warrant an exam.
It has to be a unanimous vote, right? Unanimous by the 3-person panel?
It's my understanding it's majority, but I'll get confirmation for you on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the numbers that you were, and so there's a whole set of statistics that I can try to get you. I don't have them at my fingertips, but the numbers that you were citing related, I think, to something different, and that is that at some point in the process, the determinations unit, before I arrived and as the events in the TIGTA report were unfolding, the determinations process were forwarding certain applications to the RU for potential consideration, for potential future action. And there were 60-some odd cases that were forwarded for the RU for the review. And that's the numbers I think that you were citing. But there's a whole broader set of referrals that come into the RU, and the percent of what's on one side of the political spectrum or the other is something I don't have at my fingertips to know.
So I understand this correctly. The numbers I cited, you're saying that these came directly from the determinations unit and not from outside sources to the examination?
It came, these referrals came from the determinations unit, but let me finish the story here, which I think is important, which is when I installed new leadership into EO, a gentleman by the name of Ken Corbin, who's our acting director of exempt organization, he immediately sent those 60 right back to determinations unit and asked them to relook at the issue Because what Ken is doing, what Mr. Corbin is doing, is essentially reviewing all the procedures associated with EO in general. That includes determinations, that includes exam.
Yeah.
And he's taking certain steps to make sure that everything is re-baselined and that everything that moves forward is done over appropriate safeguards. So all the numbers that you just cited, all of those are no longer with the RUV. They've all been sent back.
It's my understanding that these numbers were, these were numbers referred to exam, these were flag cases that then 100% of those that got audited were right-leaning groups. I mean, others were referred to, but the number...
Let me clarify that too.
Okay.
There's been no audits. In fact, and I know this is a question that the committee may have, and I'm happy to delve into it. There have been no exams that have been completed of any organizations for potential political activity from 2012 through 2013, and we're still in a period of suspending all exams. And if the exam was started, the taxpayer was contacted and said, we are suspending the exam. Why? Again, because when I sent new leadership in, Ken Corbin, I asked him to make sure that all the appropriate safeguards are in place to ensure fair, effective, efficient processes within EO. And so we paused any exam while we could examine this entire process that you're referencing to make sure that it has those appropriate safeguards. And we will restart exam when that review is done and when we have assurances that all the safeguards are appropriate.
Because the cases I'm referring to were they were referred by Dallas. These were already in Dallas, referred by Dallas for audit.
Right, those are 60 cases, and again, those have been sent back to Dallas and are no longer on a path towards potential exam at this time.
So that whole process is on hold?
The whole process is on hold.
Okay. Because, I mean, bottom line is we want to make sure that this process is fair and the proper
Absolutely.
safeguards. And I know, according to the IRS, the three-person committee process that's put in place is, quote, to ensure equity, transparency, that no one individual could select organizations within certain classifications for examination, end quote.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
So as we look at this examination process, and again, we've just started going down this pathway, do you have any information to suggest that Lois Lerner sought to influence any particular audit selection decision? I mean,
I have, let me start with this, that we have safeguards in place that would prevent an individual from doing that. And you just described, we have this.
Well, that's a
committee
statement, but
three.
we're not sure if the process, I mean, it's one thing to have the directive, but we're worried about the fact that, you know, with the numbers I cited, that perhaps we saw some intervention.
I have no evidence that I'm aware of where you can say from point A that an individual in the IRS directed that a certain audit should or shouldn't happen and that it actually did or did not happen. And
You can't
why
rule it out yet, though. You can't rule out that there was some meddling with the
Well,
process.
we're working through all the documents and we're looking at all the issues and you know, sending all those documents to you. And to the extent there's something that should be flagged and looked at, we're ready to flag it and look at it. But I'm not aware, again, of the situation in which an individual intervened to make sure an entity got audited or not audited, and that actually happened.
One last question.
Yeah.
Did Lois Lerner seek to intervene in the examinations process or audit process?
I'm not sure that I can fully answer that question because all those documents in Lois's email file need to be further reviewed. I will say this, that there were emails that we turned over to you based on your request. Again, part of my message here and part of my focus point is ensuring transparency. So you have the full complement of Lois Lerner's emails, and there are certain documents that raise questions. And when I looked at them, I thought they raised questions. And so what I've done is I've provided the ones that I thought raised, I gave them all to you. The ones that I thought raised questions, I provided directly to TIGTA, and I also provided them to the Accountability Review Board within the IRS, which is set up to review this matter to see what actions may warrant personnel action or discipline. And so a lot of these emails need to be looked at, they need to be evaluated, they need to be better understood, and so we're in the process of doing that.
Right. You can understand our concern. When we saw those initial numbers and then Lois Lerner's statement, you know, that I can't do anything right now, raised the flag. And so the fact that you cannot rule this out that she sought to intervene in the process, the examinations or audit process, is something we need to continue to, both you have to pursue it, we have to pursue
Yeah, I
it.
provided relevant documents to the right processes, including your committee, to further pressure test on these questions. But again, one of the keys to my focus point is making sure that going forward, there are specific safeguards in place to prevent this. I don't know that it happened. I have no evidence that points to that someone influenced and we actually had an audit decision changed. But what I do know is right now, Ken Corbin and the team are looking to make sure that there are appropriate safeguards at every angle so that none of this, no risk of undue influence in this process could ever occur. That being said, I don't know, and there's no evidence that it did occur, but there are emails that you referenced that we are looking at and asking questions about.
And I would hope that if you do find evidence in your review that there was undue influence by anyone at the IRS trying to influence that process, that you will share that with us promptly.
Absolutely. I have two, I've mentioned this a couple of times, it's worth reiterating. I have two very critical focus points to what I think is most important for me to be doing right now. One is making sure I'm getting all the facts to the relevant parties seeking those facts, including your committee and other committees. And two, fixing the problems within the exempt organization unit, and we are off to an extremely strong start in doing so.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for being here. Let me just ask you, have there been any findings to date that the processing of tax exemption application was political motivated?
No, I'm not aware of any finding of that like that.
Have there been any finding that the process of tax exempt application was influenced by anyone outside the IRS?
No, I'm not aware of any evidence of that.
You don't have any proof, you don't have any knowledge or anything like that?
I do not.
Based on your review, were organizations that represented both sides of the political spectrum singled out for additional review?
Yes, there were. There was what I like to call diversity across the political spectrum at various stages of the process. Diversity in the be on the lookout list, diversity in the type of agencies that received unnecessary questions. There was activities across a political spectrum.
Now, Mr. Commissioner, it's my understanding that the IRS Inspector General released a report yesterday saying that the year 2012 enforcement collection was down by $5 billion. That's 9%. Could you please explain how budget cuts have affected the IRS operation? What effect has the sequester had on the ability to collect revenue and provide taxpayers service?
It's been significant. We are down from fiscal year 2010 to the present, roughly $1 billion in budget authority. Our staffing is down by 8,000 or 9% staffing reduction, and that has an impact. The IG report that was issued yesterday is a manifestation that these budget cuts have consequences. Those consequences include less people on the job doing debt collection, doing enforcement, and we are down actually $7 billion in revenue from enforcement between 2010 and 2012. And it also impacts our ability to serve the taxpayer. We don't have as many people on the phones answering questions, and therefore our metrics in terms of ensuring that we're serving taxpayers and getting their questions answered are down. Things like our taxpayer assistance centers have reduced hours, and some of them are closed. So across the board, our budget cuts are having an impact. Now, we are doing everything we can to work effectively and efficiently within them, and we're cutting costs where we can. We have a 68% cut in our travel training, 45% cut in other travel. We've cut our printing by 30%. We've cut professional and technical services by 25%. So we're doing what we can to stem the impact of these budget cuts, but the reality is they are taking a toll on our mission-critical operations.
Mr. Chairman, last question. Let me just ask you, Mr. Commissioner, since your 30-day report, new leadership has been installed at all 5 levels of management, responsible for exempt organization, including top IRS leadership. As a result of your action, what improvements have you seen in the agency?
Well, I think there's been significant improvements, and it's, you know, it's a blend. I mean, I brought some expertise to the table. I brought in 2 individuals in particular from outside the IRS that are longstanding civil servants with public sector expertise. What I did that I think was very important is I brought in expertise from other parts of IRS. Like Heather Malloy, who was the head of our large business division, was the acting deputy commissioner for services and enforcement, and she has been overseeing, working with Michael Julianell, who's now the acting TEG commissioner, and Ken Corbin. All of these folks have IRS expertise from elsewhere. They're working closely with the EO determinations unit, and I said it in my statement. You know, there's a dedicated team of people in the EO determinations office that are working really hard. And the changes it's soup to nuts. I mean, we really are re-engineering the process. And you know, this is an unfortunate situation. And in my 30-day report and today, I'll reiterate, there are some very serious, concerning findings from that TIGTA report that need to be corrected. But there are some, I think, exciting changes that are starting to take hold within EO. For example, the self-certification process that we put in place. We now have a process where a taxpayer can get a quick, streamlined C4 approval just by certifying to certain commitments in terms of not spending a certain amount of their resources on political activity. And we've had 36 applicants that were on this backlog for a long time, and all they had to do was come in, sign the certification, and they were good to go with their C4 approval. That's the type of change and reform that I think is going to help us manage our backlog going forward. And I can go on, but there are very specific changes, both to improve our safeguards, our controls, and our checks and balances, and also to improve the customer, the taxpayer's experience by giving them streamlined option, a bigger voice in this process, and the ability to manage their process through the IRS more effectively. It's been a very busy few months.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. Are you back?
Thank you, gentlemen. Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Warfel, TIGTA reported that in addition to inappropriately screening applicants for tax-exempt status, that the IRS also took additional steps of requesting donor information.
Yes.
This is particularly dangerous because confidential donor names, if released through the application process, would be subject to disclosure. So despite assurances that the donor lists were destroyed, this committee's investigation has found that the sensitive donor information remains in the IRS files for these groups, putting these individuals at risk for even further targeting. Mr. Warfel, can you assure us right now that these donor lists are not being used to target donors?
Let me answer the question in 2 parts. One, I just learned last night about the potential presence of these donor lists, which were intended to be destroyed. And I'm not exactly sure yet why the media is reporting, or there was a press release, I think. I think this committee and my team need to get together to understand exactly why this committee believes that those donor lists were not destroyed as intended, because they were supposed to be destroyed in the August 2012 timeframe. If they have not been, if you have evidence that they have not been, then we need to, because it may be, for example, that we gave you a case file before August 2012 and that you found it in there before we put our destruction order in. There may be some other explanation, or we may have missed it. And if we did, we need to figure out why we missed it and make sure it gets destroyed. Your second question, absolutely my commitment. I mean, one of the absolute fundamental directions that I have provided and my team is operating on is there is no longer, in any way, shape, or form, is it acceptable to use a label or a name in order to screen an applicant for additional scrutiny. It has to be based on activity. It absolutely has to be based on activity, and we are doing everything in our power to make that as clear as possible, to put it into our written guidance and instructions to have on-site review of managers over that fundamental principle, because that did that's exactly what the TIGTA report found in May, that we were using labels or names to drive decisions in terms of whether a taxpayer would receive extra scrutiny. That policy is no longer in place at the IRS, and we're doing everything in our power to make sure that it's abided by.
If the gentlelady would yield, it's my understanding from staff that those case files were in recent submissions from the IRS to our committee.
And I just don't know the time. In other words, what I want to make sure, and again, I'm just learning this information last night, one of the possibilities that it could be is that you're reviewing a case file that went over before our destruction order went in, or maybe not. Maybe there was an intent to destroy all of those donor lists that were obtained and should not have been obtained. And if for whatever reason a donor list did not get destroyed, then I need to do two things. One, make sure that it is destroyed, and two, figure out what went wrong in our process that it slipped through. And I commit to doing both those things.
Thank you.
Let me now go to staying on this topic of donor lists to remind you of a statement made by your predecessor, the acting commissioner, Mr. Miller, at a committee's hearing right here in May. And Mr. Miller tried to dismiss these requests as innocent mistakes, and went on so far as to say, and I quote, "More than half of those were not Tea Party cases that got these donor list requests, by the way," end quote. That answer was misleading, and the committee's investigation has now established that 24 out of 27 groups asked for donor information were right-leaning. That's right. It was an overwhelming majority. 89% of all groups inappropriately asked for donor names were right-leaning groups. Your own report indicates that the IRS has not been forthcoming or accurate in its response to Congress about targeting. Are you looking at who is responsible for briefing Mr. Miller on these facts, which appear to be intended to mislead? And can you tell us who would have told Mr. Miller to say this?
A couple of things. First of all, I think, again, this may be an area where my staff and your staff can get together on the numbers, because we have different numbers than you have. So we just need to come together, cooperate in a collaborative way, and figure out, make sure that we have, maybe your numbers are right, maybe our numbers are right, but I'm just pointing out as a potential discrepancy. To answer your other question, again, my focus point is making sure that all the facts are put on the table for the appropriate committees and processes to review. So all of the information that you requested and you just suggested needs to be investigated, I would agree. I want to investigate every single element of the IG report and make sure that we understand root cause, what happened, who needs to be held accountable, what we need to do to fix it. And therefore, we're working very closely with the Inspector General, providing all the documents that we're providing to you, to them, in fact, flagging some of them and saying this is one that you may want to look into. They're conducting interviews with employees in conjunction with the Justice Department to get to the bottom of this issue, and I'm absolutely committed to making sure the IG, the Justice Department, this committee, and other committees have access to IRS employees that you want to interview, access to all the documents that you're requesting, and together we can have an approach that gets to the bottom of these questions, and as important, positions the IRS to be successful in all the reforms I've outlined today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you for holding the hearing. And I thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being with us to testify this afternoon. Could you walk us through an application, say when a person submits an application for 501c3 or C4 approval?
I can. So what happens is we get the application in, and the first person at the IRS to touch it would be what we call a screener. Okay, and the application is Form 1024, and you can pull it down off the IRS website and take a look at it. The Form 1024 has two parts, and I think this is important. Part one deals with the identity of the applicant, information about who they are, their name as an example. And part two is a description of their activity. What activity are they planning to engage in or will engage in as a 501c4? Now, as a backdrop, I think it's important to note that under the law, they don't have to come in to apply to be a 501c4. They can be a 501c4 and just file a return at the end of the year that says that they were a 501c4, but there is an option to come in and get an application. So this is at the taxpayer's option to come in and get this approval. Now what happens, the screener takes a look at it, and one of the important points that exists today that is absolutely critical is the screener is reviewing it without regards to any of the identity information in Part 1. They only look at Part 1 for completeness. And there are very specific instructions now to the screeners that that's the only thing they should be looking at Part 1 for, just is it complete. Then they turn to Part 2, and completely divorced and separate from anything that was in Part 1, they make an assessment about the activity. And in looking at it, they may determine right off the bat, and many times they do, that there's no political activity that's anticipated here, or it's very de minimis, and they will, what we call, close it in merit. They will approve it without any further development, and that happens, and it happens often. They may say that they may mark it for what's called intermediate processing, where they don't have a significant number of concerns, but there's some missing pieces to the application, some missing content, they just want to get confirmation, so they'll mark it as intermediate. Or they have questions, and it's going to be a more fuller review, and we call that full development. They look at the activities, and they see things in the activity description that the applicant has provided that raise potential questions, that there may be, for example, significant political activity that goes beyond what's allowed in the tax code and relevant Treasury and IRS regulations. So they will say, for example, let's say they mark it full development. Then it goes to a manager. And a manager will assign the cases they receive to an agent to start working the file. So if it's a full development case, they will assign it to an agent and say, here's a full development case, please look at it and work through. So one of the things that would happen is the agent at this point in time would determine, well, because there's some questions there, I'm going to ask the taxpayer what they meant by certain things so we can get a handle on the nature of how much political activity they're going to be involved in, because that's what the law requires. We have to figure out not the type of political activity. It doesn't matter what the name of the party is or what they're espousing. It's, are they spending a certain level of their resources on political campaign intervention? And so they'll ask the taxpayer a question. Now, under our new process, that agent cannot go ask questions of the taxpayer without a manager reviewing those questions and making sure that the appropriate form and content. This is one of the reforms we've made based on the findings in the TIGTA report that we were asking unnecessary and burdensome questions. So now we have specific instructions, new training for our managers and our staff to say, this is the appropriate scope of a question you can ask. And we're also developing right now a process where we're going to put together standardized questions. These are the questions that you ask. There's no creativity here. There's a standard template. This committee will get to understand what that standard template is, so you can give us feedback as an example in terms of appropriate form and content, and that will take some of the subjectivity out of it. Based on the answers we get back from the taxpayer in terms of in response to those questions, we can then make an assessment. We may make an assessment, oh, this all makes sense. Now that they've clarified, it looks like there's a relatively limited amount of political activity. Let's approve it. Or they could say, this raises more questions. I'm going to go back to the taxpayer again, and if I do, again, the manager has to approve the questions. Or you could get a sufficient amount of information now to say, this looks like a denial. In asking the taxpayer the questions, they've revealed to us that there is going to be a substantial amount of political activity, political campaign intervention that this applicant is going to engage in. So I'm going to propose a denial. Even at that point in time, after all that, you still haven't denied. What you've done is you've sent another letter to the taxpayer and saying, based on all this information, I believe there's a denial that's pending. And then the taxpayer has an opportunity to respond again and even seek a meeting with that agent and the agent's manager. And if it can't be resolved at that point, then a final denial letter is issued, and even then, the taxpayer still has another recourse, which is they can go to the IRS Appeals Division and appeal that process. So that's the process in a nutshell. And the critical things that we've trained on, again, is in that Part 1, Part 2 distinction. Very clear that when you're screening the applicant, you only look at Part 2 to determine activity in terms of whether the case should be approved or further developed. And the other key change is before we ask taxpayer questions to confirm, We get managers to review those questions. We've retrained the managers in terms of what the appropriate tone and content of questions are, and we're working towards standardized questions to take any subjectivity out of it. That is the process in a nutshell, and I've tried to amplify where we've made some improvements.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for being here. Let's just pick up where you left off.
Please.
Because in your 30-day report, you said that you were no longer going to flag organizations based on name alone.
Correct.
And you assured us organizations were going to be judged on the contents of their applications, where you just explained.
Correct.
And even in your written testimony, you talked about the IRS's new enhanced training, which you just went through again. Yet committee interviews with IRS employees indicate that instructions given by managers regarding the screening of Tea Party groups hasn't changed. In fact, a Cincinnati screener told the committee that his manager's instructions were to send Tea Party applications to a secondary screening. And I just can't realize how you can explain this, because you send out memo after memo, but it appears that the policy and substance hasn't changed at all. So I guess what I'd like to hear is, what have you done beyond sending a memo to ensure that the manager's directives are not leading to additional targeting, because it certainly doesn't sound like the enhanced training is working at all.
Let me respond to a couple of points. First, with regard to the transcript that you're referencing, at first I'd only got to see an excerpt of that transcript. I haven't seen the full transcript, and I think if I could see the full transcript, I could get a better sense of the employees' questions, issues, potential confusion, but not having seen the full transcript, it's challenging. When I saw a broader transcript, I was able to detect at least, and again, I want to be careful about reaching full conclusions without the full transcript, that I think what the employee was indicating, that in the absence of the BOLO list and out of an abundance of caution, I'm pushing things to my manager as things settle out and I figure out what I'm supposed to do, which is different than an ongoing, use of political labels as part of this systemic program. It's more of, as I looked at the broader excerpt, more of as we transition from BOLO list to non-BOLO list, I'm seeking help from my manager on a broader set of cases to make sure that everything is good. Now, what we did as soon as we saw that transcript excerpt, just out of an abundance of caution and not having seen the whole transcript, was I immediately had the manager again issue another memo clarifying, just to make sure everyone's clear. I had them pull the entire team together, go over the memo, make sure everyone understood the exact requirement here that names, labels are no longer relevant, and that you do not need to send something to your manager simply because you see a name on a file. That is not appropriate. You send something to your manager if you see activity on the file that raises questions, if you have a question for your manager, but the name is irrelevant. The only thing you need to know about the name is the name completed, and do you have that type of information? And I've asked Ken, Ken Corbin, the director of this organization, to be very focused on this, and he's reported back to me that he continuously reemphasizes with the team. He even told me that he will sit side by side with team members on the floor in Cincinnati as they're going through this to make sure they understand in a post-BOLO environment exactly what to do. I would love to see that full transcript, come back and answer more questions about it. In the interim, I want to assure you that we take any such concern or potential confusion that an employee has seriously, and I've re-emphasized a number of times through written, verbal, and training instructions to the staff that the name has to be irrelevant. The only basis by which to move an application for further scrutiny or further review is activity and activity alone.
Well, sometimes that may not be enough. There might need to be a consequence for a mistake like this, because I have the transcript, but I'm sure you've read all of the relevant parts, because they are asked currently today, and this is well past the date that we were assured this was no longer going on. That was back in June. This is as of August 1st, asking currently, if today a Tea Party case were to come out, come before you, would you treat a Tea Party group as a political advocacy case, even if there was no evidence of political activity on the application? Is that right? And the answer is plain as day, based on my current manager's direction, I don't know how you can read that any other way, and I'm just frustrated because it sounds like somebody made a mistake. No one is being held accountable, and when my constituents make a mistake on their tax return, there's a consequence. They get a penalty. They get interest on top of the penalty. They get subsequent audits. Their companies get audited, and yet this is the kind of shoddy workmanship that we see, and it's based on political targeting, and it's just unacceptable. I hope there'll be a consequence.
Well, I know we have a limited time, but let me just make this point, that the entire framework that led to this confusion was identified in the TIGTA report, and we are going through a process to ensure accountability for those leaders and managers who were responsible for letting this emerge and not doing enough to prevent it and offer clarification. As I've said many times, that from where we are right now, compared to the day the TIGTA report was issued, every single leader in the leadership chain, from the commissioner down to the lowest level senior executive in this chain of the IRS, is now replaced with a different leader. And that's part of the process. And we still have more work to do, but the notion that there's no accountability is not correct. There is, I think, significant accountability underway and in process to make sure that mistakes that were made, poor judgment that was happening, is dealt with. With respect to this individual employee, again, I really feel like I need the full transcript to understand the issue and the context, but I can assure you we are doing everything we can to make sure these instructions are clear.
Mr. Marchant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This administration brought you in to get to the bottom of this, to find out if there was politically motivated actions by the IRS and to take corrective action. You agree with that?
Yes. I was brought in to help facilitate a process to make sure that all the facts were uncovered and that I correct the problems within this area of the IRS.
How is it possible that your investigation so far, which had to have included reviewing the emails of Lois Lerner and the emails that you have submitted to the committee, how is it possible that you've reached the conclusion that there was no political motivation?
I haven't reached that conclusion. What I've said, and let me clarify, and I appreciate the question, the conclusion that I've reached is that there's more work to be done. There's more. We're going through a process to turn over every document to this committee, but we have more documents in process, and I committed to the chairman earlier to get those documents. Where I see things right now is when I see a problem or an issue with a document, and there's certainly questions that are raised in the documents that we've provided, I immediately provide them and flag them for the Inspector General, who was working with the Justice Department to further review and investigate. Where we are right now on September 18th is we have a lot of different facts out there, and they need to be synthesized, and they have not yet been synthesized yet. I think Mr. Lewis pointed to findings and evidence of different types of political groups receiving extra scrutiny. And so that has to be factored in and balanced against some of these other questions.
But reclaiming my time, Mr. Werfel, after everything that we have seen over the last month,
yes,
it really now appears that there was really more political activity going on in the IRS than among the groups that the IRS was investigating. What is the current employment status of Lois Lerner?
She is technically still employed by the IRS.
Do you have any precedent in the history of the IRS where a high-ranking IRS official took the Fifth Amendment before a standing committee of the House of Representatives and remained in employment?
I'm not aware of that precedent. I'd have to go back.
This is why the people back in my district have lost confidence in this process, have lost confidence in this investigation, and really are becoming very suspicious about the fact whether we will really ever get to the bottom of this. What do you intend to do as all of these emails come forward, as you see growing evidence? You said you've asked the Justice Department to step in. Have you asked the Justice Department to come in?
When I arrived at the IRS back in late May, already in place was a joint TIGTA Justice Department investigation. And on my first or second day there, I met with the Inspector General, and he explained the rules. He explained to me how the investigation is what my role was, what his role was. And again, I want to do everything by the book within appropriate legal requirements and follow all of relevant laws and regulations. I will not do anything outside of the strict laws, regulations, and processes that govern these investigations. But within those lines, I am being as absolutely aggressive as possible in making sure that all the facts and all the relevant information gets into these parties. I have, for example, and this is in my testimony, 150 people, many of them attorneys at the IRS, working day and night to get these nearly 400,000 pages of documents up to you so you can do exactly what you should be doing, which is raising questions about
The other issue, when I go back home every weekend and I talk to the groups in my district that are still waiting, some of them over a year, still waiting for just a simple yes or no. And the assurances have been given by you, your predecessor, and by the IRS that process has been streamlined, that it's been it's getting attention. These people back home deserve an answer.
They do. I agree.
Please follow through up on this.
I will. It pains me too, and I assure you, we're doing everything we can to relook at this process to make sure that it moves more quickly and swiftly. It is too slow right now. I absolutely agree. But the reforms that we put in place, and I'm happy to spend more time with you or your staff detailing exactly how we're looking at re-engineering these processes to make these improvements, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that they take effect and take effect quickly.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Before I go to Mr. Rangel, Mr. Werfel,
Yes.
could you clarify for us right now what is the complete C3 and C4 backlog? Do you have those numbers?
I do. The overall backlog, combined C3, C4, is 65,213 applications as of August 23rd, 2013.
That's the combined number.
That's combined for C3 and C4.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe you can get us the split between them.
Yes, I
Yeah.
don't have the exact split. It's mostly C3.
Okay.
And that's only because we get many more C3 receipts. So, for example, I do know in the chart I have here that so far year to date we've received 58,000 roughly C3 applications. We've received roughly 13,000 C4 applications. So you can do some rough percentages to get a sense when you look at this.
And one last question on that. How many of those are in arrears by a year or more?
That I would have to get back to you on.
Okay.
In terms of
If you
how
could
long
do that,
they've been.
because
Yeah.
we want to make sure the process is not continuing.
It's yeah, absolutely. You should absolutely have those numbers, and that's what I was just telling to Congressman Marchant. It's a process that needs fixing, and we are fixing it.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for this courtesy, and let me thank you for your public service. I know you've heard it before, but Republicans and Democrats truly believe that the integrity of the tax collection service, that fairness is so necessary if we are going to have the successes we've had in the past. And so I want to make it clear that it's not so much whether or not we're dealing with the question of honesty and dishonesty, but even the perception that a taxpayer is not getting a fair shake is the paramount thing that we have to leave with. Now, I want to ask the question, do you see any reason why any political activities at all should enjoy tax exemption?
So that's a question that I don't think it's my role as acting IRS commissioner to answer. I have a responsibility to affect and implement the tax code and the appropriate treasury
Try
regulations.
to frame the question in one that you could answer, because you are an expert in tax law, and this tax writing committee, we know darn well you're supposed to enforce the regulations, but in addition to that, you're supposed to give us advice as to how we can perfect and make the system better.
Let me answer the question this way.
Good.
I think, obviously the tax code says, and I think this may be where you're leading. The tax code indicates that a C4 organization has to be exclusively in the business of social welfare. In 1959, a Treasury regulation was issued that defined exclusive as primary.
I know.
Now,
I started from the beginning. Do you think we should be involved in any tax-exempt privileges for political activities?
I don't have an opinion on it. I don't have an opinion on
God, as a tax expert, do you think we need incentives for people to make contributions through the tax code?
I'm completely focused on administration and implementation of the tax code.
Okay, well, it's my fault, because my intent is so clear that I have no reason to believe that you should not be able to answer it. But I want to move on and ask you, do you believe that the IRS had the authority to change the legislation to make it partially political activity? Do you believe they had the constitutional authority to do that?
It's a good question. I think
I don't want a good question. I'm only asking what you think. I'm not asking you to be a constitutional scholar, but you are the acting commissioner.
I will say this. I think the transition from the word exclusive in the law to primary in the reg raises questions, and it's for that reason, if you'll allow me. One of the recommendations the IG had was to engage in a process to relook at that regulation, and we committed to doing that, and we've started that process. Treasury issues something called the Priority Guidance Plan, and issues what regulations we're going to be pursuing. And we put on that Priority Guidance Plan, which was just issued, I think, in August, that we will investigate a regulatory process to relook at this question.
I don't know what relook means, but are there words there that you think that political activity should be included under the privilege of tax exemption?
Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to go out to the public, and we're going to have a public dialogue about this question of what the reg should say. Should it be more narrow towards exclusive? Should it be more on the spectrum towards primary? We're going to have a process.
And to all of these questions, if someone asked your opinion, you would say it's up to the people in the street and members
I would
of
say that
Congress.
it was
You
the
don't
Treasury.
think that it's proper for you to give a professional opinion about the existing tax code as it relates to tax preferences for political activities?
I think the appropriate lead official for that is the Treasury Secretary, and I think my role is to advise him and others in this process on what is administrable in the IRS. What can we effectively administer within our resources and within our capacities? That's what I think the role of the IRS Commission
Thank
is.
you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Paulson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, also for holding the hearing. Mr. Werfel, keeping taxpayer information secure is vital to protect taxpayer privacy, deter fraud, and identity theft, but it's also the law. Leaks of taxpayer information are referred to TIGTA, of course, which investigates each case and then determines whether to refer that case to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Now, back in August, you assured the committee that the Obamacare Data Hub would be very secure in securely conveying taxpayer information. Now, you said the IRS already transmits taxpayer data, and of 8 million transactions that happened in 2012, there were only 24 improper disclosures of taxpayer information. Now, committee staff spoke with TIGTA to verify the number that you provided, the 24 number, and TIGTA says that in 2012, there were actually not 24, but 200 different leaks of taxpayer information reported to TIGTA. Where did you get your information on the 24 number? Because even TIGTA does not know where that number came from. In fact, just during the course of the last few months, My understanding is that the committee has made you aware of at least 8 unauthorized disclosures of confidential taxpayer information. So how can groups such as the National Organization for Marriage, of course, which has come up in this hearing after hearing here in this part of the investigation, whose donor information was actually leaked, have any confidence that the IRS is going to safeguard that confidential information from public disclosure?
Well, first of all, separating out any specific taxpayer to make sure that I'm clear of any 6103 issues and lifting the question up more generally. Let me start with the data discrepancy. I would love to meet with TIGTA and understand, make sure that we're making the same assumptions. My numbers, I think, were reflecting any data breaches that might have happened by state and local governments that are receiving information, for example, in Medicaid. They might have a broader definition of what they're talking about in terms of capturing the 200 versus the 28. So I will work with TIGTA, and we will get back to you on a particular reconciliation of those numbers. The process is extremely robust, but not absolutely risk-free. And we are required under the law, again, this goes to the IRS's responsibility to administer the tax code, to furnish this information to effectively run programs such as Medicaid and now the Affordable Care Act. And we have a very robust plan and action that we go through to validate the security of that data as it leaves the IRS, and in the case of the Affordable Care Act, as it travels through HHS into the exchanges. And as we get closer to October 1st, we are working extremely diligently with HHS, with the exchanges, to make sure that all those protocols around IT and data security are in place. And they're extremely robust. They're not absolutely risk-free, unfortunately. I wish they could be, because any breach of sensitive taxpayer information is enormously troubling and should have consequences. Sometimes it's inadvertent, and the consequences are on the IRS to relook at our controls and safeguards and update them. Sometimes it's advertent, and in those cases, we refer those to the Justice Department.
Let me ask you another question. To dispel any accusations of wrongdoing, your agency released the names of dozens of different targeted groups that had been since approved. However, our investigation has found out that of these groups, 83% of those that were flagged for the IRS surveillance program, described by Chairman Bustani earlier, just happened to be right-leaning. And now you've told us that the surveillance program has been suspended for these organizations. So the suspension of the program, as well as the numbers, certainly seem to suggest that extra scrutiny was somehow inappropriate in the first place. So, Mr. Werfel, were agents under instruction to flag right-leaning groups for surveillance?
I'm not aware of any such evidence of that. The reason why we suspended it was out of an abundance of caution. I sent a new leadership team in there, and I said, I want you to make sure that you're comfortable that not only is the process as efficient as it needs to be, not only is it efficient and meeting the demands of the law, but that all the appropriate safeguards are in place. Whether it was mentioned in the TIGTA report or not, I wanted a comprehensive review of all appropriate safeguards. So out of an abundance of caution, not because there was particular evidence, we suspended activities until my new leadership team in there could get comfortable that all the process and safeguards are effective. And it's not going to be forever. We're working very hard to make sure that those confirmations can be done quickly so we can restart this process, because exams is a critical part of what we do in order to enforce the tax code.
Are you aware, or did anyone inappropriately influence the selection of these groups for surveillance?
Again, I struggle with the word surveillance. I mean, in terms of referral to the RU, if that's what you mean, I'm not aware of it.
Let me just ask you this, too. Did Lois Lerner have a role in the way that these groups were flagged or processed?
Off the top of my head, I don't know that she did, but specifically, but I will say this. The director of the exempt organization unit has responsibility for overseeing the operations. This is one of the operations. I could talk to you about what I think are the appropriate types of overview that individual should have, and that appropriate is making sure that doing what I'm doing, making sure we have the right leadership team in place, putting in the right processes, the right safeguards. But to the extent it ever would bleed into a specific direction that this entity that the process said should be audited, going in and changing that conclusion, to me that would breach inappropriate behavior.
And Mr. Werfel, I know we're running out of time, but you mentioned earlier that Lois Lerner is still on paid leave. How long do you expect that she will be on paid leave? Have you asked her to resign?
So let me do two things with that question. First of all, let me articulate that I can, under the constraints of the Privacy Act, I can give an employee's status, but I can't go beyond that. But what I can do is lift up out of Ms. Lerner and talk generally about our process. And what our process is that I committed to running a process to ensure that there was accountability for any individuals who could no longer hold the public trust because of certain responsibilities they had in the findings of the TIGTA report. That process involves, I put together an accountability review board, which is looking at all the documents, all the issues, and understanding what different managers or leaders, what responsibilities they had. That process is going through and looking at all those documents and doing those inquiries. It takes time. I'm as frustrated as anyone. I want the process to go quick. But as we described, there's 400,000 pages of documents, so it's not something that can happen overnight. What I will say is this. We are making progress. We're closer to the finish line than we are the starting line in terms of running through this process. And I expect that in the near term, we'll start seeing conclusions coming out of these processes.
And Mr. Chairman, as you know, I mean, Lois Lerner is the one person who knows the most, who can answer the most, and who has refused to testify.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. And Mr. Werfel, thanks for being here. Can you just kind of describe for us, what does public trust mean? Define it for me.
It's something I've given a lot of thought about, actually. I'm a 16-year civil servant. Public trust involves making sure that we are acting consistent with the principles of the mission of our agency, principles of impartiality, that we're meeting our various ethics responsibilities, that we're following a rule of law.
Yeah.
And I am and I think my team would tell you this, and it dates back to the course of my career. I'm very stringent around the rule of law.
And I understand that. But then let's move on to, now, Ms. Lerner, how long has she been on leave with pay?
Again, I wish I could answer that question for you. I potentially could answer that question in a different setting, but because of the Privacy Act, I can't get into the specifics of a given employee's personnel process.
Okay. Well, you told this group that Ms. Lerner was not going to be involved. In fact, it goes down to this. It says that you told the committee that Ms. Lerner is on administrative leave, still being paid by taxpayers. She does not have access to any IRS systems, not even her email, and that she has no functional control over EO division. In fact, you even hired a new acting director of exempt organizations. Yet, after the TIGTA report and this committee's investigation, taxpayers are still getting letters signed by Mrs. Lerner. Now, this letter I have here is dated August the 7th. 2013. That's why I asked, when was she put on administrative leave? When did she plead the Fifth? And if that's the case, why is she still sending out information? I'm
not aware of the issue that you're raising. I have never seen the document that you're holding in your hand, and if you provide
that's one we got from you folks.
I will.
So, and I know there's 300,000.
I will look into it and get back to you.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, please don't take this personally, but I've never seen anybody come here and answer about how many new committees, new panels that you're going to get to, and you're going to hold an accountability. Who has been held accountable for anything that's happened so far in the IRS? Well, and this is not, I mean, some people describe it as a phony scandal. It's not a phony scandal. The only thing I see phony so far is the investigation of it. Tell me, where exactly are we on this?
Let me ask you.
The short version. Give me the short version.
I'll give you the short version as best I can. I've said it earlier. All 5 levels of leadership, from the commissioner down to the SES in charge, are no longer in their jobs.
I understand that.
Okay, that's one.
But they're still
working
somewhere. They're still working somewhere.
Or
they're still being paid by taxpayers. Is it a yes or no?
Not in all cases.
Not in all cases.
Yeah. In order to hold an individual accountable in the federal government, there is a process. It is one that is driven by congressional laws.
Mr. Ward, I want you to understand something. Do you know the American public has heard enough of this Washington spin about how people are held accountable? Accountability in Washington is putting you into another agency and go to work there. It's never holding anybody accountable for wrongdoing. You come here today, we're asking you very specific questions. The first time you came here, it was too early to ask you. I understand. This is a great thing you've put together for us. This is great. On page 12, you say, All the various fact-finding efforts underway will have a direct bearing on decisions we will make about additional accountability measures. Consistent with our approach to date, if there is sufficient evidence to conclude that an individual can no longer hold a position of public trust within the IRS, we will take appropriate personnel action. What is appropriate personnel action? Is it being transferred to another agency? Or is it actually holding somebody accountable to the American people the way they would be held accountable if they gave false information or they did something that the IRS didn't find that was in accordance with what the taxpayer is supposed to do? See, that's where the disconnect is here.
Congressman, there are many situations in government where an agency moves to dismiss or terminate an
I'm not
employee.
talking about many agents. I'm talking about wrongdoing. There is overwhelming evidence right now, and if we're saying that we're just not sure yet, we're not sure, when 83% of these groups were right-leaning, when 94% of these groups that are being selected for surveillance are right-leaning, the audit selection statistics arising from EO surveillance program are the most alarming. 100% of the groups that were ultimately selected for full-blown audits were right-leaning. And we're waiting to see if we can connect the dots to see if there was possibly anything that could have linked this activity at the IRS to wrongdoing. This is appalling that we even have to have this meeting. And I'm being told that Lois Lerner can take the fifth. Lois Lerner is still signing letters on IRS stationery. There's a huge question there. You know, you are in charge of a 97,000-person agency that has about a $12 billion budget. This is incredible. I understand how tough it would be, but don't you think the American people deserve an answer sometime about people being held accountable for what they did was wrong? They need to be not just sanctioned, they need to be put in jail for the wrongdoing that they did. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Werfel. Are you constrained by law in taking action against, yes or no,
Absolutely.
against Ms. Lerner? You are constrained by the law.
In general, I'm constrained by, and I don't know if I like the word constrained, there is a process. It's a legal process put in place to protect federal employees.
Can you fire her today?
I cannot fire any employee today without going through a very robust and thorough process that is set out in law and regulation.
So, Mr. Werfel, maybe what we're suggesting is the gentleman might want to put a bill in to change the laws that exist today.
As long as the
If
law...
the gentleman would yield, I already have.
No, well, then see it forward, Mr. Chairman. I have the time. Then the gentleman has the ability, as a member of Congress, to see that bill forward, but not to badger the gentleman at this time. I, by the way, would like to badger a little bit myself, so reclaiming my time. Thank you for being here today, and thank you, Chairman Bastani, for holding the meeting and the hearing, and Mr. Lewis as well. A few months ago, the same subcommittee held a simple hearing on tax-exempt division at the IRS and hosted the woman we're speaking about right now, Ms. Lerner, as our witness. At that hearing was held 2 days before that same witness, Ms. Lerner, informed the world through a planted question that the IRS has been inappropriately targeting civic and public affairs groups seeking nonprofit exempt status. I was especially angry at this disclosure, as at that hearing I previously mentioned, just 2 days before her planted confession, I directly asked about the issue of politicization at the IRS and was given a basic non-answer. Months later, and after several investigations, hearings, and lots of noise and unfounded accusations, we've been able to uncover a few important truths, what I would like to go through. But what I will suggest is that maybe Ms. Lerner took the Fifth Amendment because of her attempt to mislead this Congress, this subcommittee, at that particular hearing, and 2 days later planted that question. Maybe that's why I believe she took the Fifth Amendment. And regardless to any other criminal investigation may be going on, it is a crime to mislead Congress. It is a crime not to be truthful when asked a direct member from this committee and get a non-answer or a false answer only 2 days later to do it in a public setting. But let me just, the few important truths. There was no political motivation in the selection of applications for review. Both progressive and Tea Party groups received additional review. There was absolutely no interference or coordination in this political targeting by anyone at the White House or Treasury. No IRS agents have ever been cited or even been accused of forcing their own personal political ideology onto the process of granting nonprofit status. In fact, the screening manager of tax exemption applications is a self-identified conservative Republican, as well as the person who first reviewed this and screened the applications to see if any of them could be approved. But America saw something else, something we see all too often in this Congress, a double standard. We saw, and we heard it again today, the outrage by my Republican colleagues that the Tea Party groups were targeted, but no similar outrage when progressive groups were targeted. I was outraged, as many of my Democratic colleagues were outraged when Tea Party groups were targeted, but I didn't hear that same level of outrage when it was focused on progressive groups. We have, while I'm pleased you are here, Mr. Werfel, to give us a progress report, it is time for this committee to also demand honest answers from the Treasury's Inspector General as well, and a complete report on this issue. No American should be targeted. No American should be targeted for their political beliefs, whether conservative or progressive. But this investigation into the abuses of Americans will not be settled until we hear from every party, and that means the time is now for my Republican colleagues to join us in demanding the answers from the IG. And speaking of continuing abuse of Americans, just a few minutes ago I was informed that my Republican colleagues released their bill to fund the government and include in the continuing resolution language that forces the U.S. government to prioritize its payments so that foreign banks and creditors will always be paid first before any American if our country defaults on its debt. What this means in the real world is the Republicans that run the Congress today believe it is okay to bring our nation to the point of default on its bills, and if we go over the cliff, mandate the Treasury pay foreign creditors and banks like the Bank of China before Social Security recipients, VA pensioners, Medicare recipients, doctors, or just about any other American. Mr. Werfel, I fear that if the Republicans' Pay China First Act is enacted, Americans will see delays and possibly denials of their tax refund checks as their dollars will be diverted to pay foreign banks first. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, there's two issues there. I think government shutdown, if the debt limit is breached, it all has extremely chaotic impacts on the government, obviously, but talking specifically about IRS, very chaotic impacts on the IRS. In essence, in a shutdown situation, most of the IRS footprint is shut down, not all of it, but most of it. We can't process taxes, we can't enforce, we can't collect debts. There's so many things we can't do that have a direct impact on our bottom line deficit, so there's certain irony there. But absolutely, I'm extremely concerned about the mission critical operations of the IRS given the potential for a government shutdown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. It's not the intent of the Republican side of the aisle to shut the government down, and we're hopeful that we'll get to a solution on this.
Chairman,
now recognize
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Reed.
I really ask we have a clean debt relief bill before
We're
the House.
recognizing Mr. Reed now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Werfel. And I'm watching or listening to my good friend from New York, Mr. Crowley, demonstrate that I think Ms. Lerner...
Will the gentleman yield?
No, the gentleman will not
Are we really
yield.
good friends now after this? Now, let's see, after your testimony.
It sounds to me as Ms. Lerner has very few friends left here on this Hill, and rightfully so from the testimony or the questioning that Mr. Crowley has asked of you and how she misled this subcommittee. So I want to focus in particular on Ms. Lerner and Ms. Lerner's emails. First and foremost, you said you have reviewed emails from Ms. Lerner. How many email accounts did Ms. Lerner have?
I'm only aware of one within the IRS, but I do know that she also used a private email account as well. So I don't know if you're going to count that, but
yeah,
one email
absolutely.
account within the IRS, and I do understand through the email discovery that she also used a personal email account.
She used her personal email account, that's correct. And you have an obligation to be truthful to us too, Mr. Werfel.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate that, and I just advise you of your responsibility to us. I would like to ask you, we have some emails that I'd like to go over with you that have been made privy to us and display them and ask your input on them. I believe there's 3 emails in particular that I want to look at where, and we can put it up on the display, the first one, where Ms. Lerner is addressing an email to her subordinates. And you see in the email it says, Tea Party matter, very dangerous. Have you seen that email before?
I have.
And have you talked with anybody in regards to that email as to what that email was intended to mean?
I did. I asked questions.
Who'd you ask questions of?
I asked questions of members of my leadership team.
Who are those leadership members? Names.
Okay. I have my acting deputy commissioner, who's no longer the acting Heather Malloy. I talked to Beth Tucker, who's the deputy commissioner for operations support. I talked to Chris Sterner, who's the deputy chief counsel. These are just various members of the leadership team.
Did you have any conversation with Ms. Lerner herself?
No.
Okay. And when you review, and this is Ms. Lerner's email account, this is from her, this is no doubt coming from her email account, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So what do you think Ms. Lerner meant when she said Tea Party matter very dangerous, in particular, very dangerous?
I will say this, I don't know what she meant, but I was concerned when I saw the email, and it's for that reason that I flagged it for the IG and for the Accountability Review Board.
Okay, and let's go to the second email. We're going through time here. This is another email that came from Ms. Lerner's email account, and in that email, it says, it would be great if we can get there without saying the only reason they don't get a 3 is political activity, I believe is the full reading of that. And in particular, I direct your attention to the statement, it would be great if we can get there without saying the only reason they don't get a 3 is political activity. So I want to ask you a question. What does get there mean?
I don't know.
But this, again, is Ms. Lerner's email, correct?
I agree. I agree it raises a question and a concern, and I think it would be helpful, for example, to talk to people that are on that email chain as well and see if they can help dissect what that means. And it's for that reason that I provided emails like this to the Inspector General, who's doing those very interviews, as is this committee. And so my hope is that in interviewing the employees on that email chain, we can get a better sense of what she meant there.
And do you think she was trying to say that somehow they were trying to approve or deny these applications?
Part of the challenge. I just don't know, taken out of context. But again, we produce these. I just want to point out, if I could, Congressman, this, in some ways, this is part of the process working the way it was intended. I made commitments that I would get all this information.
Reclaiming my time. I mean, you've gone to great pains, and the opposition, members on the other side of the aisle have gone to great pains to say that there's no political activity here. This was just something that was across the spectrum. But when you see things like Tea Party is very dangerous, we need to get there some other way than for political activity, clearly that shows to me some bias, and we'll let the American people make that judgment. So you're trying to say one thing, but this incriminating evidence leads me to believe there's something else going on there. Let's go to the third email, if we could. Are you familiar with this email between Ms. Lerner and some of her staff and other colleagues?
Yes, I am.
In regards to the FEC?
Yes.
And it says perhaps the FCC, and we're referencing Tea Party applications. And it was in reference to, I believe, a media article that Ms. Lerner was giving some opinion or expressing some opinion on. And it said in response to that, perhaps the FEC will save the day. Do you know what she was referring to?
Again, I'm not exactly sure. I would be speculating.
Do you know what article she was referring to?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I do remember asking questions and raising a concern, and this is the one.
Sure, and who'd you ask the question of?
Again, my leadership team.
And did they give you any information as to what article she was referring to?
Again, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact article. I apologize if you want to.
Do you remember the substance of the article?
I don't. I apologize.
It was something about the Senate activity and the contributions from these organizations going to, in regards to the Senate majority being held by the Democrats, and it was a threat to the Senate majority of the Democratic.
Okay.
Does that refresh your memory?
That does refresh my memory. I appreciate that.
So when Lois Lerner, who's in charge of these applications, these Tea Party applications, makes a statement in an email, perhaps the FEC will save the day. Do you think there's any political connection or opinion she's trying to express there?
I don't know. The initial conclusion I reach is that it warrants additional questions. It's definitely worth flagging, but I just don't know. It was just speculation on my part.
And let me ask you one question. Isn't it true that the agency asked Ms. Lerner to resign?
Again, that's information that's protected by.
No, it's not. I'm asking what your agency did. It has nothing to do with what Ms. Lerner did or what she did. It's asking what you did on behalf of the agency. Did you ask her to resign?
Can I consult with my team to make sure, because again, I don't.
I
I'm
don't know
not
why you would
sure-
need to consult.
I can
It's-
get back
it's
to you,
what
but I'm
you
not sure
did.
I can answer the question.
It's what you did. Did you ask Ms. Lerner to resign?
I don't want to answer the question unless I got.
You have an obligation to answer that question as a member of this committee, else you will face criminal sanctions as a result of it. Did you ask her to resign?
I'm being told by my attorney who's sitting behind me that I cannot answer that question under the Privacy Act. I potentially can answer that question.
Why is that a Privacy Act, what you did? How is that a Privacy Act? I want your attorney then to be put under oath and get up here and explain to me why you are not answering my question as to what you did in regards to this investigation.
Mr. Chairman, will the gentleman yield?
No, I won't yield. I want an answer.
Time has expired. Mr. Chairman, will the gentleman's time expired, and will he yield for a question?
No,
It ended
I
about
will
2
not
minutes
yield.
ago.
I want an answer to the
Chairman,
question.
point of information,
You have an
Mr. Chairman.
obligation to answer the
Chairman,
question.
point of
I will
information,
hold you
Mr.
accountable.
Mr.
I will hold you accountable
Mr.
as a
Chairman,
member
point
of
of
this subcommittee.
information.
Mr. Reed, suspend. Mr. Reed, your time has expired.
I mean,
Mr. Chairman, point of information, Mr. Chairman.
You're raising a point of order?
Point of order. A point of information. I'm asking a question to the committee.
Ask your question.
The first,
Be
this,
brief about it.
sorry?
Be brief about it.
This particular memo and the previous memos, who redacted these memos?
It's my understanding that these redactions are to protect private information.
My question is,
Potential
Mr. Chairman, who
6103.
redacted the memos? Was it done by the IRS?
No, this was committee staff.
Can we go back to the first memo, Mr. Chairman? The Tea Party matter very dangerous. Without knowing what else is behind there, that's taken out of context. I'm sure Holly's protection was not important because Holly is mentioned. I don't know who Holly is.
The gentleman will suspend.
The
The gentleman suspend. Mr. Levin has access to that information.
That's not my question. I asked who redacted it. And unless the public, which is before a public committee, can see if we have access to it, why is it certain aspects were redacted?
Will the gentleman
would
yield?
leave some with a
Will
different
the gentleman
impression.
yield? I still want an
I
answer
don't
to
have
my
the time,
question.
Mr. Chairman.
Hold on.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have the time to yield, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you have no time, so therefore I defer.
Both
to that.
gentlemen,
I've been
both
recognized
gentlemen,
by the chairman.
both gentlemen will suspend.
We're not friends anymore. Just kidding, just kidding. Just kidding.
Mr. Crowley?
Yes.
You will suspend. Thank you. Mr. Levin has that information. That's as much as I'm going to say about that.
But, Mr.
That's-
Chairman, again,
No.
point of information, Mr. Chairman.
That- I've given you the
What is
information.
the purpose of redacting this matter? That's the question I'm
Mr.
asking.
Crowley, you're out of order.
Mr. Chairman, I'm asking a simple question. What's the purpose of redacting this statement? And not redacting Ms. Holly's name, who obviously...
The gentleman will suspend. All time has expired. This committee has now reached the conclusion of its questioning of the witness. Mr. Werfel, I want to thank you for appearing before us today.
Can I just make one clarification in response to Mr. Reed's question, which
Yes.
is if the record for this hearing is going to be kept open for a few days, what I'd like to do, because I really do want to be as responsive as I can, is go back to the IRS, confer with my attorneys what are the appropriate legal constraints I have in answering that question. If I can answer that question and the record is still open, I will submit an answer officially for the record. If I cannot answer that question, I will reach out directly to you, Mr. Reed, explain it, and have our staffs get together or us get together in person to work through the issue together. That's my commitment.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you,
that.
Mr. Werfel. And as we conclude this, once again, I want to reiterate how important it is to get these documents to the committee so that we can fully investigate this and complete this investigation. It'll be in your best interest, the IRS's best interest, and in the best interest of the American people. There are very disturbing things that we found in the documents we've seen so far with regard to the examination process, and we're going to continue to look at this. So, Mr. Werfel, we thank you. Please be advised that members may submit additional written questions that can be answered in writing, and those answers, as well as the questions, will be made part of the formal hearing record. The subcommittee now stands adjourned.
We're friends.